So, I like underdogs, but not in this case, because the underdog, as I said and will say again at New Chapel, is not David in this story. It's just... Malcolm Gladwell wrote a book, just 2 or 3 years ago, I think, or recently. He's a good writer, but sometimes in this case, he wades into a story where he's really a dilettante. He doesn't really know what he's talking about. He's not trained he's a journalist. What does he know about biblical literature? Not much. And that's pretty evident to you if you read his book, with all due respect. But he reads the David and Goliath story the way, frankly, a lot of us do, including a lot of clergy who should know better, but they're not trained well enough to know better, I think. As a fable, as a moralistic tale, the bigger they are, the harder they fall, or if you just believe in yourself, you can overcome giants. Now that may be true, but that's not at all the takeaway. That's not at all what's going on in the David and Goliath story. All you have to know who the underdog is just read in 1 Samuel 17 what Goliath says when he defies the God of Israel. The moment he does that, his something is grass, right? He has no chance. And he certainly has no chance against somebody with the skills of David. David is like that guy in that movie Taken, Liam Neeson's character, I have skills. Yeah. If you just return my daughter to me, that'll be the end of it. But if you don't, I will hunt you down and I will kill you. That's who David is in this story. The moment the Philistine giant, Goliath of Gath, defies the armies of the Lord, the armies of Israel, and defies thus the Lord himself. So it's often considered an underdog story, and there's only one sense in which it really is, and that is if you understand that Goliath is the underdog here. So, yes, Bob, I'll start with that. Only a boy named David, only a little sling, only a boy named David, but he could pray. My wife, where'd she go? She was right there a moment ago. Oh, she's holding our granddaughter, Gemma. Everybody say hi to Gemma. That's my... Oh, yeah, that's my granddaughter, my one and only granddaughter. And anyway, but he could pray and sing. He could pray and sing. Only a boy named David, only a rippling brook, only a boy named David, but 5 little stones he took. Well, first of all, he wasn't a boy, and the stones weren't little. But look, that song is translating or interpreting a story that's not written for children, not written for Gemma or Sam or Benjamin. This is the whole Bible is not written for children. And it's okay to write a children's Bible and translate it to that audience, right? It's fine to do that. It's fine to sing this song. But the boy, David is not a boy, and I'll talk some more about that. And the stones are not little. That story, the song tells the story as if it's an Arthurian legend, right? Like the sword and the stone. And I love the sword and the stone, right? My point isn't to derogate stories like that or fables. But the point is to say this is not one of them, right? The David and Goliath story is not a fable, though many times it gets that treatment from people. Nevertheless, it's not a moralistic story about getting your courage up. I think sometimes, somebody asked me many years ago, a seminarian asked me, Phil, in the Episcopal Church, you don't have to learn Hebrew or Greek, the biblical languages, to be ordained a priest, and that's a shame. We really should require at least one of those languages. I think the Presbyterians still do. I'm not sure of that. But a seminarian asked me, Phil, should I learn one of the biblical languages? Well, by the time you get to seminary, it's a little late to get started, but people do it and manage to do it well. I'm a late bloomer. My parents are here, and they can tell you how late a bloomer I am, right? But I did bloom eventually, and early enough to start studying biblical languages as an undergraduate. So I had something of a head start. I said to the seminarian who asked me, how do you feel? What advice would you give me about learning biblical languages? And this seminarian said, can you read the Bible in English and encounter the Lord? And the answer to that question is, of course you can. Everyone in this room reading an English Bible, the Lord, by the power of the same Spirit who inspired that book or collection of books, can open your eyes and you can meet the Lord reading in English. But if you're going to be a teacher, if you're going to teach people, if you're going to go into a vocation like mine, people manage still to teach people in English. That's fine. I don't want to get too high-minded about this. I don't want to badmouth anybody. I'm going to be writing about David and what David does when he hears about Saul's death. You're going to get this text next week. When David hears that Saul has died, he hears that from an Amalekite messenger. He grieves, and he writes the most beautiful lyric poem as a eulogy. It's there in the first chapter of 2 Samuel. He refuses to badmouth even somebody as wicked as Saul. And I was deeply convicted by that over my recent summer vacation. We really need to take to heart controlling the tongue and not bad-mouthing people. That's become a high art in American culture these days, and we are not going to participate in it. Anyway, I said to the seminarian, well, yeah, you could teach people reading the English Bible, but I'm just going to go ahead and say this because it's actually what I said to the seminarian. I said, you can make love with gloves on, but why would you want to? Right? And I use that analogy because handling biblical text, I've said this, I think, once before, but maybe now's the time to repeat it. What do you hear when you hear text? Well, if you're my mother's son, you hear textile, right? I can tell you, if you wanted, growing up, I went into the fabric store with my mom. Let's just say more than a few times for more than a few hours. And she taught me the value that you can discern the value of a textile, of a fabric, not just by looking at it. You know this. You don't have to be Japanese and a seamstress to know this. By running your fingers over the text. Textile, text, textum, same idea, right? When you're reading a piece of literature, whatever it is, run, as it were, your fingers over it. And that means you've got to slow down. David's poem, you'll hear it next week, his encomium or eulogy for Saul. Saul did terrible things to David. He was trying to kill him. 3 times he's trying to kill him. But when David learns about his predecessor's death, he does not. He refuses to badmouth him. All he has to say is everything good that could be said about Saul. Isn't that moving and convicting? It is to me. So anyway, as you run your fingers over this text and slow down enough to do that, you'll see some things, like I said, and I'll say it again at 11:15. Our English translations tell us that David struck Saul in the forehead. And indeed, you can see here, this is Caravaggio. I think this is the Caravaggio, David and Goliath, that if you're in Rome, you go to the Borghese, you'll see that. That's about 1610. And you see Caravaggio, and by the way, we didn't learn anything about 4Q. In 1947, the Dead Sea Scrolls, a little boy throws stone into a cave. He hears an odd sound. The stone hits a clay jar, and thus was discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls. And 4Q is a manuscript 1,000 years older than all the manuscripts our English Bibles are translating. When they translate this story, reveals a lot of things, including some things about the height of Goliath. But here you can see Caravaggio, right? He's not English, right? What is Caravaggio? He's Italian. So in Italian translations too, in every translation really, depending on those Hebrew manuscripts, the stone strikes Goliath in the forehead, or between the eyes, we might say. But mitzach, which is what's translated forehead there, means anything on the front. And indeed, earlier in 1 Samuel 17, even our English translations tell us that Goliath was wearing greaves of brass. What's translated there, greaves, mitzach, right? Shin armor. He doesn't strike. I mean, as I say, just think, I'm not a physicist. You don't have to be one, though. You can just take 6th grade physics. And somebody struck in the forehead by a stone weighing, it wasn't like the Whammo slingshot. It was more like a billiard ball and much more dense. Barium sulfate, I think, which is more dense than granite. It's what you find there in the Valley of Elah. Somebody struck, let's just say, by something the size of a baseball that weighs, let's just say, 3 pounds. They could weigh up to 9. And that is going 110 miles an hour, which is how fast a man could sling a slingshot in the ancient world, using David's sort of sling, which we'll see in a moment from Bernini. You hit somebody in the forehead, which direction is he going to fall? Backwards, right? Every time. But we're told that Goliath falls on his face. That's a pretty decent supporting clue that he's not struck in the forehead. He's struck, as I say, on the mitzach, in the shins, in the greaves. So he falls, and that's what David wants to do. He doesn't want to just kill the guy. He wants to humiliate him and then kill him. So now I mentioned the 4Q, the Hebrew manuscript of this story, which is 1,000 years older than the manuscripts that give us 6 cubits in a span. If you ever wonder what a cubit is, from your elbow, if you're me anyway, from your elbow to this knuckle, that's a cubit. Half of that, 9 inches, is a span. A cubit is 18 inches. Well, 4Q, discovered in 1947, tells us that Goliath was not 6 cubits in a span, but 4 cubits in a span. What's the difference? That Goliath was not 9 feet 9 inches tall, which is taller than this ceiling by a considerable number, right? But that he was 6 feet 9 inches tall. As I say, and I'll say it again at the next service, you can accuse me of trying to deconstruct the Bible or whatever and cut it down to size. But I'm just being honest with you folks. I just don't believe that Goliath was almost 10 feet tall, right? That's a tall tale. And as I mentioned, how tall were people in the ancient world? In David's time anyway, they were 5 feet 3 inches tall, a half an inch shorter than my wife. So a guy 5'3", let's assume David was 5'3", going up against a guy 6 feet 9, right? That's what's going on here. So here's another. This one's in a German museum. This is also Caravaggio. It's, again, around early 1600s. And you can see, well, take a look now at David. If just looking at that depiction of him, how old would you say Caravaggio thinks he is? Not a little boy. I told you, my guess is that David, in this, when he confronts Goliath, is about 19. I can't prove it. That's my best guess. I'd say that guy looks about 19, right? And then I'll go ahead to, this is Bernini's masterpiece. Take a look at that online. You can find pictures of it from different angles. If you can see the sling here, right? This is a large scale. David is larger than life. I mean, that's almost stating the obvious. But if you visit this Bernini and take a look at it, he's a big guy, right? Sculpted this way. But there's his sling, just as I was telling you. He's not the underdog in this story by any means. Okay, so I mentioned that this manuscript that I'm talking about from Qumran, 4Q, is 1,000 years older. Just to be clear with you guys, even a first-year student of what's called biblical criticism, the kind of thing you learn when you're in graduate school or maybe divinity school, even a first-year student of biblical criticism understands that just because a manuscript is older or 1,000 years older doesn't necessarily mean it's more reliable, right? But this one, well, 4Q, it turns out that the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament dating from the 3rd century BC, and the venerable early 4th century Codex Vaticanus and the Lucianic Recension, so several significant streams of the Greek Old Testament, also say that the Gittite giant was 4 cubits and a span. It's not just 4Q that tells you that. 6'9", not 9'9". By the way, the Bible itself tells us not to exaggerate, to be careful not to exaggerate the enemy. 2 weeks ago in a vestry meeting, a member of the vestry asked a very fair question. She expressed, if we do what we're fixing to do as a parish with the support of the vestry, what I'm calling Team 150, why am I calling it Team 150? Because it's so much easier to say that than to say, how would you say 150 in Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it's so much easier to say 150 than sesquicentennial. Amen. Now, Colin has no trouble saying it, but our 150th anniversary as a parish is coming up early November of 25, and we're going to make hay with that. And we're going to allow that to organize our aspirations for the glory of the Lord here. We're going to, in that year of anniversary, we're going to start with a big conference. When I say big, I mean a conference that will attract people from all over the continent and from Europe maybe too. Actually, I'm pretty sure it will. Who will come here to be encouraged to follow, to love and serve the Lord. Anyway, Team 150, that's an ambitious thing that we're planning to do, and you'll hear more about it. To proclaim the gospel, to win more people to Christ, and win those who are already encountering Christ here deeper into a deeper relationship with Him. So that's Team 150, and the member of the vestry said, well, here's my question. What if this doesn't go well? What if, we invest in the kinds of things, Father Ellsworth, that you want to invest in? And she's a wonderful, devout, godly woman, and I said, I quoted Proverbs 22. What does Proverbs 22 say? I've been reading through the Proverbs, studying them recently, and Proverbs 22 says, the sluggard says, there's a lion outside. What does that mean? It means the Bible, the Proverbs understands that human nature being what it is, when we have a tendency to exaggerate the challenge, to make it bigger than it is, because we don't want to do what the Lord is telling us to do. We use it as an excuse. There's a lion outside. Right? We do that in our personal lives, right? Victoria asks me to do the dishes, and I say there's a lion outside. So the Bible itself says that we need to be careful not to exaggerate the enemy. And frankly, I think 9:9 is exaggerating the enemy. We don't need to do that. You don't need to imagine problems even bigger than they are in order to excuse yourself for not doing what needs to be done. The enemy is bad enough. We don't have to make him bigger and badder. By the way, I don't say this in the sermon, but back to Goliath falling on his face in the 5th chapter of 1 Samuel. You might remember where the Philistines capture the Ark of Yahweh and bring it into the temple of Dagon. The next morning they come in to find that Dagon has fallen face down. His head comes off just like Goliath's, almost just like. And then when was Goliath killed? He wasn't killed by the stone. That's just a debilitating blow designed to humiliate him. In the 50th verse of chapter 17, David, we're told, struck him down and then he killed him. This is what's called in Hebrew the converted imperfect narrative tense. In Hebrew, narrative repetition is often a sign of what's called synchronicity. You tell stories using a layering technique. You say something, then you have a recapitulation of it. You want to say it again, and so you repeat something, and that lets the reader know, oh, this is something happening the same time as that. We're going back and filling in detail now. So in Hebraic literature, it's often the case that they tell a story not A, B, C, D, E. That's what we're used to as English readers. But they tell it A, B, or A, C, E, B, C, D. Anyway, the point is this. He strikes Goliath in the shins. I'm an army brat, so I just eat this stuff up, right? I grew up playing cowboys and Indians and army. And so he strikes the mitzach, the shins, so powerfully that the blow breaks his legs. And then he runs up, and this is clear in the Bible, in the English translation. David runs up to Goliath. There he is, right? This is the battlefield, champion against champion. And Goliath is lying down, this guy that was talking smack, right? And Goliath runs up to him. David runs up to Goliath, that's right. In front of all the Philistines and the Israelites. And he reaches down and he grabs Goliath's sword. Picture this. He grabs Goliath's sword from out of his hand or his sheath. And then he picks up Goliath's head by his hair. Let me go back to this. Yeah, that's a good one. Picks up his head by his hair and he cuts his head off. And he shows it to everybody. He's not a show-off. But boy, if you have the temerity to defy the God of Israel and the armies of Israel the way Goliath did, you've just signed your own death warrant. You might say, oh, well, Phil, isn't Goliath an image bearer, a precious image bearer? No, not at this point. He's not. And I think we got to be careful as Bible readers not to so tame the scriptures that we lose track of what's going on there. Because when we impoverish our own spiritual lives, when we tame the story, right? The Bible is a work of military history. I don't say that because I'm an army brat. I say that because I read the Bible closely. And you read Genesis from the 3rd chapter of Genesis to the end, and what you are clearly reading is a work of military history. What I've said it before, it's timely to say it now. When Jesus sets his face to Jerusalem, which his disciples do not want him to do, and they knew him a lot better than I do, right? Too many clergy badmouth the disciples. Big mistake. Don't do that. When they see Jesus set his face to Jerusalem, and when they see him deliberately stage a triumphal entry into Jerusalem on a donkey at Passover, they know what he's doing. He's picking a fight. All right? This story of David and Goliath is one of the stories that's rustling like leaves in their minds when they see him do that. Nobody does that. Nobody does that. As I've said before, if there were hundreds of messiahs, would-be messiahs running around Israel or Palestine in that time, people claiming to be the Messiah, preaching good news to the poor and liberty to the captives, not a one of them dared to mount a donkey and ride it into Jerusalem at Passover. Why do I say that? Think about Jair and his 30 sons and their 30 donkeys. You ride a donkey into a city, you're saying, this city is mine. That's what Jesus is doing. He's picking a fight. He takes that fight all the way to Gethsemane and to his arrest and to the cross. In the West, we have, with the Western Church, especially since the Endarkenment, some people call it the Enlightenment, but the Western Church, really, its primary way of understanding what Jesus is doing on the cross is, its atonement theory is a substitutionary theory, right? Jesus dies in your place. He makes the sacrifice, and he gets us out of debt. And let me be careful. That's a biblical theory, right? My point is not to say that isn't true. No, you can find all kinds of scriptures that support that theory. What I'm telling you is we need to recover what's called the Christus Victor theory of the atonement, which is just as biblical. And frankly, you can tell it's way more dramatic, right? It moves my blood more than substitutionary theory does. That just might be me. And that's why you have evangelicals, and I am one, by the way, right? Every Christian is an evangelical, just as every Christian is a Catholic, right? Our tradition, the Anglican tradition, understands that we're both Catholic and evangelical, at least in our better moments. But evangelicals so emphasize substitutionary theory that you have evangelical churches all over the world who don't even observe Good Friday. And why should they? Because, if what Jesus does on the cross is basically a fiduciary transaction, well, okay, the transaction was done, right? That is just as obscene, frankly, a way of looking at Jesus and his passion as the presiding bishop of the Episcopal churches some years ago. It was, let's just say 15 years ago. The Episcopal Church is meeting in General Convention this week. But the presiding bishop of this church Lori probably knows it, maybe it was 15 years ago, said that Easter was about a riot of flowers in the spring. That is obscene for any Christian, any baptized person, let alone a bishop of the church, to say that about the resurrection. But guess what's just as obscene? To reduce what Jesus does on the cross to a fiduciary transaction. That's just as obscene. We notice the one. That's a move the liberals make all the time, right? Reducing the passion of Jesus to a metaphor. But let's look at ourselves and say, hey, Jesus doesn't just make a fiduciary transaction on Good Friday on the cross. He slays the bastard. He takes on Satan. He takes Satan's greatest weapon, death, and following what I like to call the Benaiah principle, takes that weapon, death. Benaiah took the Egyptians. Benaiah only had a club. He was attacked by an Egyptian with a spear. He takes the Egyptian spear and turns it around and runs him through with it. That's what Jesus is doing on the cross for you. He is our champion. He is the victor with no rival. And this is so important to live into, right? And to proclaim. You know, we lived way too timid as Christians, right? We should boldly proclaim this story to a world that's dying to hear it, right? That's what this church is all about. And so in our Team 150 year, our sesquicentennial year, what we're going to say, 150, thank you, Pricey. We're going to say this church has stood here for 150 years proclaiming that story. And by God, we are going to be here just as faithfully for the next 150 years, proclaiming it to a world that will die without it. So, David and Goliath, any last question? We got time for a question or two. Yeah.
If Goliath wasn't that big, really, why do you think an entire army of trained soldiers was afraid of him?
Well, okay, first of all, would you stand up here for a second? She's 5. Yeah, she has. So right now she's another couple of inches taller. Okay. No, just stand flat-footed. She's 5'3.5" without shoes on. Okay, Jenny?
I've got that half.
6'9". You know how tall 6'9" is? 6'5". Tom, come up here. You're 6'5". You're just a shrimp compared to Goliath.
I'm taking my heel off.
There we go.
So there's 5'3", there's 6'5", okay? Goliath is like that, okay?
Whoa.
You're pretty scary.
Like I say, I can't prove it. Maybe he was 9'9". If you want to believe he was 9'9", fine. I'm going to stick with 4Q. No, by the way, no, it's a battle of champions, by the way. He's defying the army of Israel, but it's 1 against 1, okay? Yeah.
I was going to say that is, whoever Goliath came up against from the army of Israel, he not only would be taller and more massive, he would also have to reach well beyond.
Yeah, you know, when Goliath sees him,
Put them down one at a time, send in the next one.
when Goliath sees David with his sling, what does he say to him? Right, but what else does he say? Come to me. He's not, I don't know, he's maybe not as stupid as he seems, right? You see somebody, let's say 19, let's assume I'm right about that. Somebody who knows what he's doing with a sling. You may taunt, you may talk smack, but you see him with the sling, and of course you want him to come to you, right? Because with that sling, he has an advantage that he doesn't if he's within reach of you. So that's why Goliath says, come to me, right? Another question quickly before we have to go. Come on, somebody ask. Yeah, Jonathan.
So, just a quick question about the Hebrew wording for the front of the body.
Yeah.
So, it could be anywhere on the front. You said it was the greaves. Is that because the same word is used for the greaves itself? So you just...
It's the exact same word, mitzach.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that repetition is what prevents it from being somewhere else on, say, the thigh or anywhere else. Is that what you're doing?
Yeah, that would be a reasonable assumption, an educated guess.
Well, you were saying physics of it, too. You follow
falls face down, it makes sense to say, oh, he got his feet knocked out from under him and he fell face down.
Mm-hmm. When I used to hit my shin on a coffee table, my Yokohama mama would say, "Why you do that?" Because it hurts, Mom, that's why. One last question. Yes,
So
Janet.
So one-on-one, but then you've got this humiliated Philistine group of people. They just say, oh, well, we lost. Or what was the next part of that story?
Oh, they were slaughtered. That's the way that works in the ancient world. Your champion loses, you lose, and you don't go home to tell about it. And it's right there in the text if you just continue reading the chapter. All right, guys. Who loves you? Jesus does.